Christian Horner has been sacked from Red Bull. But do you really know the real reason? Is it because of poor performance? Is it because Max Verstappen didn't want him there anymore? If that's what you believe, then you're completely mistaken. The truth is far more shocking. Christian Horner is on the verge of signing a blockbuster deal with Ferrari, and it's set to be revealed in the coming days. Watch until the very end of this video, but only if you want to uncover every detail of Horner's stunning new contract with Ferrari. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Christian Horner's sudden and covert removal from Red Bull Racing wasn't a resignation, wasn't a retirement, and wasn't a farewell. It was a power implosion disguised as silence. For a man who had become the face of one of Formula One's most successful dynasties, his absence was louder than any scandal. No press briefing, no handshake send-off, no staged tribute on social media. He vanished like smoke in a windstorm. But behind that silence was a brutal political collapse born from months of strategic deceit, internal warfare, and calculated betrayal that even seasoned figures in the sport failed to anticipate. What appeared on the surface as a quiet transition was, in reality, a high-stakes exfiltration of influence, knowledge, and control that would ripple through the entire structure of Formula One for years to come. The first indication of the unraveling didn't come from a journalist or an engineer. It came from an overlooked air traffic controller stationed in Emilia-Romagna. A private charter, filed under a false company name, had landed quietly at dusk. On board was a British national using an alias tied to a dormant offshore account. The plane's tail number traced back to a firm with historical ties to both luxury consulting and confidential mergers. What began as an irregularity in a flight log spiraled into a security alert within Red Bull's upper command. They didn't suspect, they knew. And when a confidential surveillance report was discreetly passed to senior management, the name that emerged shattered every assumption they held. Christian Horner had entered the beating heart of Ferrari's headquarters in total secrecy. What followed was a cascade of confidential revelations. Horner had not only held extensive, off-the-record discussions with Ferrari's executive committee, he had already reviewed transition strategies, outlined staff realignments, and submitted feedback on Maranello's current operational inefficiencies. He didn't arrive as a guest, he arrived as a prospective architect of a new era. Encryption protocols had been used. Non-disclosure clauses had been invoked. Legal contracts had already circulated between Italian and British law firms. Witnesses confirmed that a 3-hour session had taken place in a subterranean conference bunker, an area typically used for top-tier classified development. No personal devices permitted. Multiple exits monitored. Even the catering staff had been swapped for trusted, vetted personnel. It was an operation that mirrored espionage more than employment. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Back at Red Bull, the reaction was not confusion, it was nuclear. The leadership convened within minutes of confirmation. Executives who had shared stages and strategy sessions with Horner stared at internal security footage in disbelief. How had he kept this hidden? How deep did the deception go? The truth was worse than imagined. Burner phones traced to prepaid accounts across multiple countries. Message logs stored in private servers accessible only via biometric authentication. Payments to consulting firms that had no websites, no staff, no contact info, shell companies, hiding shadows within shadows. This wasn't a negotiation gone rogue. This was a defection disguised as leadership. Horner's betrayal wasn't merely professional, it was personal. The people he had mentored, the engineers he had defended in boardrooms, the strategists who had built their careers under his protection, many were blindsided, others felt humiliated. Some even confessed to doubting their own instincts, wondering how long he'd been planning this quiet exodus. The psychological damage was immense. Meetings at Red Bull HQ turned into interrogations. Friendships fractured. Trust dissolved. And at the center of the storm, the name Horner was scrubbed from internal communications faster than any prior figure in the company's history. No legacy. No loyalty. Just liability. Meanwhile, Ferrari's leadership, though stoic in appearance, was already adapting to the seismic shift they had engineered. Horner wasn't coming as a figurehead. He was being positioned as the man who would completely restructure Ferrari's political landscape. He demanded complete autonomy, freedom from legacy bureaucracies, and direct access to the budgetary arm of the Agnelli empire. In return, he promised transformation, a reimagined operations blueprint, an overhaul of technical chain-of-command hierarchies, a recruitment plan targeting disillusioned talent across rival teams, and an aggressive pivot toward AI-integrated race simulation and predictive telemetry. It wasn't ambition. It was a coup. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Red Bull's reaction moved beyond internal panic and into legal warfare. Emergency consultations were held with international law firms. Redacted documents were leaked to independent journalists, hinting at inappropriate contractual breaches. Liberty Media remained tight-lipped, but behind closed doors, they were furious, not about Horner's choices, but about the instability such a move could trigger across the sponsorship ecosystem. Title partners, already hesitant over recent controversies, began calling for clarity. Rumors spread that energy drink executives were demanding a full audit of the team's leadership and media strategy. There was even whispered talk of relocating core F1 operations out of Milton Keynes altogether. Other teams watched with morbid fascination. Mercedes privately questioned whether Toto Wolff had underestimated Horner's long-term ambitions. McLaren's junior staff openly speculated that Horner was planning a domino effect, luring other technical minds across the paddock into Ferrari's expanding sphere of influence. Even Aston Martin, normally removed from such politics, allegedly commissioned an internal review to assess their own vulnerability to high-level defections. The paddock had transformed from a competition zone to a chessboard, and Horner had just castled early, flipping the entire endgame. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Despite the chaos, Horner himself remained completely hidden from public view. No airport sightings. No tabloid appearances. Not even a vague "no comment" from his representatives. Some claimed he was in Monaco, coordinating logistics with a select group of loyal engineers. Others believed he was in Switzerland, working with a secretive sports consultancy that specialized in competitive restructuring. But for many, it didn't matter where he was, it mattered what he was building. And make no mistake, he was building something. Whispers suggested he had already initiated contact with potential replacements inside Red Bull, offering them new roles under Italian contracts. One top aerodynamicist had already quietly left Red Bull's Slack network without explanation. Ferrari, on their side, played a perfect media game. No confirmations. No denials. Just a stoic silence that radiated power. They didn't need to say a word. The silence itself was the message. They had landed the sport's most unpredictable mastermind. And Red Bull, they were too stunned to spin it. There were internal memos encouraging staff to stay focused and remain loyal to the long-term mission, but everyone knew the mission had already changed. The empire had cracked. Not because of a driver. Not because of a car. But because the man who held the keys to the kingdom had chosen to burn it down from the inside. This wasn't just a career move. This was a hostile takeover of the future. Christian Horner had rewritten the rules of engagement in Formula One, not with horsepower or lap times, but with precision, manipulation, and absolute control over the narrative. The question was no longer why he did it. The only question now was what happens next. And for the first time in over a decade, Red Bull had no answer. Inside the hushed, high-security walls of Ferrari's command center, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't a courtesy meeting, and it wasn't a brainstorming session, it was a reckoning. The stakes weren't theoretical. They were visceral, urgent, and irreversible. Christian Horner didn't enter the room as a guest or an outsider. He walked in like a storm that had already been forecasted by those tired of drifting in dead air. But it wasn't just his arrival that ignited the room, it was who flanked him. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, Ferrari's most celebrated and scrutinized assets, sat beside him not out of curiosity or formality but out of purpose. Calculated, composed, and unwavering. There was no press. No handlers. No distractions. Just raw ambition and the people who could either reshape the team or let it rot from within. Hamilton's face was unreadable, but his body language was unmistakable. He had traveled down this road too many times, with teams that promised clarity and delivered chaos, with leaders who spoke of vision but led with hesitation. He had gambled his legacy on this move to Maranello, expecting reinvention, elevation, destiny. Instead, he'd found indecision. The strategies were inconsistent, the hierarchy was blurred, and the accountability was non-existent. He wasn't bitter, he was surgical. The time for waiting had expired. The clock wasn't ticking, it was roaring. If this season didn't turn, his story would end in wasted potential, not legacy cemented in history. Leclerc sat still, eyes sharp, jaw clenched, not out of fear, but restraint. The quiet disillusionment that had been building in him was no longer quiet. He had given Ferrari everything, loyalty beyond reason, patience beyond limits. But year after year, he watched the dream turn into a recurring nightmare. Every time he walked into that paddock wearing red, it felt like a promise being broken in slow motion. The passion, the pride, the belief, it was all being chipped away by a machine that couldn't decide who it wanted to be. And now, sitting across from the future, he had no intention of pretending anymore. His silence wasn't consent. It was pressure. Focused, relentless pressure. The room held its breath when Hamilton finally leaned forward. His words weren't dramatic, they were carved from experience. Each syllable, a bullet. He wasn't pitching. He wasn't negotiating. He was laying down the terms for survival. "Christian," he said, voice low, smooth, and chillingly firm, "I didn't leave one mess to walk into another. I came here to win. Not someday now. I don't want discussions. I don't want diplomacy. I want answers. I want structure. I need to know exactly where I stand. Because if you're not taking full control, we're wasting each other's time." It wasn't a question. It was a demand for definition. For order. For wartime leadership. The kind of leadership that didn't flinch when things got complicated, when the politics got nasty, when the world started to doubt. He wasn't searching for a friend. He was hunting for a commander who could go into battle without blinking. Leclerc didn't shift in his seat. He didn't glance at Hamilton. He didn't need to. The energy in the room made everything crystal clear. If Hamilton was aligned, if Horner was confirmed, then Ferrari wasn't turning a page. It was tearing the book apart and rewriting it in blood and fire. Christian Horner stared back at both of them with the cold clarity of a man who had already survived the wolves. The media storm, the boardroom warfare, the internal betrayal at Red Bull, none of it had broken him. If anything, it had refined him into something more dangerous, more calculating, more efficient. He wasn't there to be liked. He was there to win. To dominate. And for the first time in years, Ferrari wasn't holding auditions. It was forming a regime. He leaned in, elbows on the table, voice even, unhurried, and laced with finality. "You want answers," he said. "Here's one. If I'm in, this isn't a democracy. This is a mission. You'll know where you stand, every second. There's no number two. There's only results. Lewis, if you're with me, you lead. Charles, if you stay, you fight beside him. But anyone who plays games, anyone who undermines the mission, they're gone. I don't care what badge they wear." The room didn't erupt. It went quieter, as if the building itself understood what had just shifted. No one blinked. No one moved. The power had changed hands, not in title, but in truth. The words hadn't been yelled, but they echoed with finality. It wasn't a speech. It was a coronation. Hamilton gave a slight nod. Not a performance for the cameras. There were none. Just a mark of alignment. Of trust, forged in war. Leclerc, still silent, closed his eyes briefly, inhaled, and opened them again. He didn't need to speak. His presence had already written its own chapter. He wasn't endorsing Horner. He was joining him. The Agnelli emissary, stone-faced and unreadable, said nothing. His job wasn't to interfere. It was to observe. To record mentally what could never be spoken publicly. He saw what the world hadn't seen yet, that Ferrari was no longer being run by committees or consultants. It was being seized by racers. Veterans. Killers. People who didn't care about legacy unless it was weaponized. As the drivers rose from their seats, the air shifted. They didn't look back. They didn't need validation. The decision had been made. Horner remained seated for a moment longer, processing everything. Not the pressure, he'd lived with that. But the opportunity. The sheer magnitude of what he had just been handed. Ferrari, broken but salvageable. Hamilton, aging but electrifying. Leclerc, wounded but still lethal. All now standing on the same line, ready to charge. Outside, the public narrative continued. Rumors, interviews, speculation. But they were all dancing around the truth that had already solidified behind closed doors. Ferrari's empire wasn't falling. It was mutating. Quietly, violently, and permanently. And the world wouldn't realize it until it was already too late. The atmosphere inside that closed-door meeting was charged with unspoken electricity, the kind that doesn't come from arguments or raised voices but from the overwhelming sensation that something irreversible had just taken place. Christian Horner, now seated at the center of Ferrari's inner circle, didn't speak like someone sharing an idea. He delivered a decree. It wasn't wrapped in charm or diplomacy. It was sharp, decisive, clean. When he turned to face Lewis Hamilton, everyone in the room instinctively followed his gaze. Time seemed to pause, not out of politeness, but because everyone present understood this was not a regular team announcement. It was a tectonic shift in the sport's balance of power. "There are no second thoughts," Horner had said with cold precision. "You were always the plan, even when others doubted. You're not just another signing. You're the pillar of what we're building here. You're not coming in to compete internally. You're coming in to lead. And you will have absolute control of the machine." Hamilton didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in measured calculation. He had heard promises before. Empty ones. Half-truths wrapped in press releases. He had sat through briefings where support was conditional, where backing was vague, where faith was replaced by internal games. But this was different. Horner wasn't bluffing. The clarity in his voice, the tone devoid of compromise, it was all unmistakable. Hamilton wasn't being invited to fit in. He was being handed the throne. Ferrari's legacy, long defined by its chaos behind the scenes, was now undergoing a ruthless reinvention. This wasn't the Ferrari of hesitant strategies or interdepartmental friction. This was a Ferrari being gutted, rebuilt, and re-engineered with precision. Horner wasn't bringing in Hamilton to stir things up. He was placing him at the epicenter of a machine meant to crush, not coexist. And still, in the far corner of that room, stood Charles Leclerc. Observing, absorbing, calculating. He didn't interject. He didn't resist. He didn't need to. The cameras weren't rolling, the journalists weren't watching, and yet his restraint told the loudest story. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he understood. Leclerc, once heralded as the future of Ferrari, now stood as a man who had seen too much, endured too many heartbreaks, and lived through too many false dawns to confuse this moment with betrayal. It was clarity, not defeat. The nod Leclerc gave wasn't passive acceptance. It was strategic surrender. He knew what this meant. Not just for the team, but for himself. And rather than push against the tide, he made the rare, high IQ move of aligning himself with it. Because this wasn't about being number one anymore, it was about being part of something unstoppable. Leclerc had played the hero before. Now, he had the rare opportunity to play the architect's right hand, not the understudy. Behind the scenes, engineers exchanged glances. Department heads mentally rewrote roadmaps. Simulations would now be adjusted to Hamilton's preferences. Aerodynamic development, chassis feedback loops, pit stop rehearsals, every pulse of the team's workflow would now orbit around Lewis's rhythm. Horner didn't hide it. He wanted an empire, and he wanted it fast. And Hamilton, with every record, every championship, every moment of brilliance etched into F1 history, was the perfect foundation stone. And Charles? He wasn't vanishing. He was evolving. Because only a fool would underestimate what Leclerc could become when freed from the burdens of carrying a disorganized empire. 4 years, he had been Ferrari's savior, its PR darling, its poster child. Now, he had a chance to be lethal without the distractions of internal firestorms. With Hamilton taking the heat, the media pressure, the political noise, Leclerc could become something even more dangerous. Silent, sharp, precise, and devastating. Outside that room, the sport would speculate endlessly. Could two alpha drivers coexist under one roof? Would Leclerc rebel? Would Hamilton dominate at Leclerc's expense? But those questions belonged to people who hadn't seen the moment unfold, who hadn't witnessed the clarity with which Horner laid the groundwork. This wasn't about appeasing drivers. It was about building a dynasty. And Horner wasn't playing favorites. He was crafting a system so streamlined, so synchronized, that neither driver would waste energy on politics. They'd channel everything into performance. Hamilton, for all his accolades, had never been given this kind of blank check, not even at Mercedes. Now, he wouldn't just drive the car. He'd shape its destiny. His feedback wouldn't go into a spreadsheet, it would rewrite the protocol. His instincts wouldn't be debated, they'd be implemented. And in return, he would be held to the highest standard. No excuses. No fallback narratives. Just results. And Leclerc, having watched all this unfold, was no passive observer. He had the instincts of a predator. He knew that behind the public smiles and statements of unity, real dominance wasn't declared, it was earned over race distance. And he was ready to fight. Not against Hamilton, but through him. Around him. With him. Because if this experiment worked, if Horner's high-stakes vision delivered, it wouldn't be a rivalry, it would be a revolution. Back in that room, the finality of Horner's words still hung in the air. No one dared challenge them. The direction was set, the course unchangeable. Ferrari wasn't simply hiring a legend. They were lighting a fuse. And what came next wasn't just about trophies. It was about rewriting what a team could be when egos were recalibrated, when vision overpowered vanity, and when greatness wasn't pursued, it was constructed. And with Hamilton at the wheel, Leclerc beside him, and Horner directing the orchestra, Ferrari wasn't chasing redemption. It was orchestrating conquest. The atmosphere inside the Maranello operations complex was dense with tension, but not the kind born of conflict. It was the weight of history being rewritten in real time. What began as a supposedly routine internal strategy discussion had morphed into something far more consequential, something bordering on revolutionary. No one dared to interrupt. No one checked their watches. Every key player in Ferrari's organizational command chain, from data analysts and pit strategists to legal advisors and executive stakeholders, sat in total silence as Lewis Hamilton, standing without notes, no slides, and no hesitation, redefined what it meant to lead a Formula One team into the future. His words didn't just challenge the current structure, they shattered it. Hamilton didn't offer tweaks or minor recalibrations. He proposed uprooting the very foundation of how Ferrari executed a Grand Prix weekend. The slow and hierarchical communication loops, the fragmented coordination between departments, the traditionalist mindset that treated past glory as a substitute for present innovation, it all had to go. He spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through championship battles, who had felt the pulse of a winning machine and the silence of a missed opportunity. He demanded fluidity between departments, real-time analytics flowing seamlessly from the garage to the control room in Maranello, synchronized decision nodes that could process critical data and deliver execution-level commands in milliseconds. This wasn't a brainstorming session. It was a transfer of power dressed in strategy. Hamilton laid out a modular operations framework built on the principles of hyper-responsiveness, absolute data clarity, and multi-tiered redundancies. He didn't frame his plan as a copy of Red Bull's model, though he acknowledged their operational brilliance. Instead, he offered a hybrid vision, retaining Ferrari's unique identity, its emotional gravity, its heritage, but fusing it with cutting-edge, clinical precision. It was like taking a cathedral and equipping it with quantum processors. Christian Horner, known for his composed yet razor-sharp demeanor, listened with his fingers steepled, saying nothing until the room had fallen completely quiet. Then, with a slow grin that barely cracked his face, he said, "This is how dynasties are born. Not with luck. With systems." It wasn't praise, it was confirmation. A subtle but unmistakable green light. From that moment, the old order ceased to exist. Though Fred Vasseur still wore the badge of team principal, the energy in the room no longer gravitated toward him. His interjections were met with respectful silence but were devoid of traction. The momentum had shifted entirely, not by force but by conviction. Ferrari's hierarchy, once so tightly guarded and resistant to change, was unraveling at its highest levels, not with a bang, but with calm, calculated deliberation. Task forces were instantly assembled. Detailed action matrices were drafted on the spot, starting with post-summer personnel rotations. Job descriptions were rewritten in real time. Evaluation metrics were overhauled. Every division, from aerodynamics to pit crew logistics, was placed under accelerated review. Hamilton wasn't merely inspiring these changes, he was embedded into the implementation pipeline. He would vet candidates for critical roles. He would sit in on daily debriefs. His influence would no longer stop at the cockpit. Legal counsels moved swiftly. Confidential documents were circulated with ultra-restricted access, filled with complex language meant to shield the truth from public interpretation. Terms like executive synergy recalibration and multi-dimensional performance realignment masked what was undeniably a bloodless coup. Ferrari's media handlers, already experienced in shaping narratives, were briefed on a comprehensive rebranding campaign. Public-facing language would frame everything as a proactive leap forward, a natural evolution rooted in ambition, not desperation. Mock headlines began to take shape. Ferrari re-engineered, the new pulse of Maranello, when passion meets precision. Behind the scenes, whispers multiplied. Veteran staffers who had survived multiple eras, Schumacher, Alonso, Vettel, said they had never felt such a complete upheaval. Not even in the Tote Braun era had the core of Ferraris been so thoroughly interrogated. This wasn't about tweaking for results. It was about rewriting the entire philosophy of what winning looked like. The technical teams were instructed to audit every procedure, every tool, every protocol. Tire degradation models were cross-validated with external algorithms. Radio call protocols were reprogrammed to include a parallel decision track in case of software failure. Simulators were recalibrated not just for driving inputs, but to recreate chaotic, unpredictable scenarios where adaptability would be king. Every minute counted. Every second of inefficiency was labeled as a threat. Hamilton moved through the corridors of the facility with quiet intensity, not giving orders, but asking questions that demanded uncomfortable answers. Why was decision-making delayed by 2 seconds at Monaco? Why was there a 10-lap blind spot in telemetry during Silverstone's final stint? Why did Maranello's central AI processor not directly interface with pit wall comms during red flag conditions? He wasn't blaming, he was awakening something dormant. He was turning Ferrari into a creature of the future, shedding its romantic skin to reveal the predator underneath. Christian Horner, watching it all unfold, saw something he hadn't seen since his earliest days with Red Bull: fearlessness wrapped in discipline. Hamilton wasn't simply fixing things. He was engineering an unstoppable narrative, one that would soon bleed into every race, every qualifying session, every sector of every track. A psychological wave was forming, one that would destabilize rivals before the lights even went out on Sunday. When the final blueprints were laid out, when the legal files were locked in vaults and the new reporting chains were silently agreed upon, Hamilton and Horner stood together in the now-empty war room. There were no handshakes, no smiles. Just a quiet recognition between two men who understood that dominance isn't a matter of talent or money. It's a matter of alignment, of people, of systems, of belief. Outside, the sky over Maranello was pitch black, but inside, a storm had already been set in motion. A storm that wouldn't announce itself with press releases or marketing campaigns, but with results. On the stopwatch. On the standings board. On the face of every rival team principal who would realize too late that Ferrari was no longer playing catch-up. It was preparing to lead. And when it did, it wouldn't ask permission. It would take control. At the heart of Red Bull's operations in Milton Keynes, a storm erupted without warning. The tightly controlled environment that once functioned with surgical precision fell into total disarray the moment word spread about Christian Horner's confidential encounter. Described internally as a staggering act of disloyalty, the revelation triggered a response that was nothing short of ruthless. Senior management didn't hesitate for a second. There was no meeting to clarify intentions, no last-minute plea for context. It was done. Final. Swift. His agreement was torn apart, shredded as if it had never existed. He wasn't suspended. He was eliminated. Within minutes, his digital footprint inside Red Bull was erased. Every internal system logged him out. Credentials revoked. Emails vanished. Company devices shut down remotely. Security personnel, men who once greeted him with deference, were instructed to lock every door he could have walked through. His office, once a command center for countless world championship decisions, was stripped bare. Nameplates removed. Access restricted. Colleagues weren't even allowed to ask questions. The order was absolute. Horner was no longer part of the machine. He was removed like a corrupted file. His legacy, his authority, his influence, deleted without hesitation. He didn't return. Not even to collect his belongings. No final stroll through the garage. No goodbye to mechanics, no final huddle with strategists. He vanished like a shadow under floodlights. And while Red Bull's internal silence echoed loudly through its corridors, the paddock outside ignited with fire. Panic turned into frenzy. The man who'd been at the center of Red Bull's identity since its creation had been cut off like an unwanted limb, and no one could explain why with certainty. No memo, no press conference. Just whispers, cold stares, and locked doors. Inside the organization, the power structure began to teeter. Helmut Marko, the formidable elder statesman and gatekeeper of Red Bull's most sacred inner workings, reportedly lost control. According to multiple team insiders, he erupted in fury during an emergency executive session. His voice was raised. His fist slammed tables. His patience, long known to be limited, was entirely gone. Trust had been obliterated. Some suggest Marko saw the meeting not just as disloyalty, but as a coup attempt, a threat to his lifelong grip on Red Bull's racing dynasty. He demanded an immediate realignment of leadership. Alliances shifted within hours. Executives who had once felt secure now questioned their futures. A vacuum formed at the top, and power-hungry factions began quietly maneuvering to fill it. And while the team's internal politics twisted into chaos, the driver who had delivered them 3 straight world championships stood outside the decision-making circle, blindsided. Max Verstappen was informed after the termination had been signed, sealed, and executed. Those closest to him said his expression barely changed, but his silence said everything. The Dutch driver, known for his fire on track and ice off it, reportedly didn't speak for nearly an hour after hearing the news. He didn't protest. He didn't comment. He simply stared at the floor and walked away. For Max, it was personal. Horner had been more than a team boss. He'd been an ally, a protector, a strategic partner in his ascent to global dominance. Losing him in such a brutal, calculated way sent tremors through his camp. Behind closed doors, Verstappen's inner circle began weighing options. Some of his advisors felt betrayed by the lack of transparency. Others feared the team had cracked a critical pillar of trust between driver and leadership. Max, for all his on-track invincibility, values stability. He doesn't tolerate dysfunction. And the sudden collapse of his relationship with the man who had helped engineer his rise to superstardom didn't sit well. He wasn't angry publicly, but the silence was louder than any outburst. Sponsors took notice. Engineers watched closely. Rivals smirked. The strongest team in Formula One now looked vulnerable for the first time in years. But while Red Bull scrambled to maintain composure, Christian Horner disappeared from the public landscape. He didn't release a single statement. No tweet, no quote, no appearance at the track. He didn't defend himself, and he didn't lash out. He simply vanished. But no one in the paddock believed that meant he was finished. In fact, the silence was interpreted as something far more dangerous: strategy. Horner wasn't retreating, he was recalibrating. Waiting. Plotting. Contacts whispered that he was already in communication with other teams. Not as an advisor. Not as a consultant. As a future team leader. A force. An architect of something entirely new. Unconfirmed reports suggest that influential figures in the sport, people with deep pockets and long memories, had already reached out. Whispers of backroom meetings in Geneva. Quiet lunches in Paris. Video calls routed through encrypted networks. Names floated in speculation. Aston Martin, Audi, even outsiders like Andretti. Some insiders claim Horner's already drawing blueprints for a full-scale motorsport resurrection. Not just a comeback. A total redefinition of what it means to run a Formula One team in the modern era. A rebellion built from exile. A declaration of war on the very system that cast him out. Suppliers who once served Red Bull are rumored to be shifting allegiances. Legal teams have reportedly been hired. Marketing experts, previously loyal to Horner's brand of public charm, are back on the payroll. Media insiders speculate that he's negotiating exclusive documentary rights for a comeback story. A global unveiling. A new brand. A new name. And most dangerously, a new team built with the sole purpose of dismantling the dynasty that discarded him. He is not just returning. He is planning to dominate, to destroy, to humiliate the empire that made him and then tried to erase him. In Formula One, revenge is measured not in words, but in points. In milliseconds. In shattered podium dreams. And if Christian Horner's silence is truly the calm before a storm, then the world of motorsport hasn't seen anything yet. The man who once ruled from the front line is coming back, not to recover what he lost, but to build something even more powerful, more dangerous, and more personal. Every whisper, every secret meeting, every sleepless night is leading to a single, inevitable moment, his return to the paddock. And when that moment comes, Formula One will never be the same again. Even now, as the grid recalibrates and the world tries to make sense of it all, the true magnitude of this transformation hasn't fully registered. What's unfolding is not a transition, it's a complete rewriting of power in Formula One. This isn't just about Lewis Hamilton leaving behind the Silver Arrows or Christian Horner stepping away from his Red Bull kingdom. It's the collision of ambition, vision, and strategy at an atomic level. This is Hamilton setting fire to the narrative that he's winding down, and instead launching an assault on history from within the walls of the most iconic team in motorsport. He isn't seeking a ceremonial farewell. He's engineering a seismic aftershock that could ripple through the sport for generations. For Hamilton, joining Ferrari isn't about romance. It's a ruthlessly calculated endgame. He knows exactly what he's walking into, the chaos, the pressure, the politics, and he wants it. He's drawn to the chaos not to survive it, but to master it. He doesn't need to prove himself anymore, and that's what makes him dangerous. He's playing a game few even realize is happening. With 7 titles already in his grasp, he isn't chasing number 8 for the trophy. He's chasing it to break the system. He wants to win in red not because it's difficult, but because everyone said it was impossible. And he intends to make the improbable look inevitable. Charles Leclerc, once the chosen prince of Maranello, now finds himself cornered in a game that suddenly shifted its rules. There's no longer time for growth, no margin for learning curves. Every practice session is a referendum on his status. Every qualifying mistake, every strategy complaint, every flash of doubt is magnified tenfold. He's no longer the project, he's the pressure point. He must evolve from protege to predator, or risk becoming a passenger in a team that's being rebuilt around someone else's image. But buried beneath the weight of expectation is a fire. And if he channels it right, he might not just survive, he might become the weapon Ferrari didn't know it needed. Then comes Horner, the man with the smile of a politician and the instincts of a general. His departure from Red Bull wasn't a collapse, it was a strategic detachment. He saw what others couldn't. The instability hidden behind Verstappen's brilliance, the tension among board members, the diminishing returns of dominance. So, he didn't wait for it to rot, he abandoned it before it crumbled. And in doing so, he brought more than expertise. He brought a blueprint. One that dismantled the once untouchable Mercedes, one that turned Red Bull into an empire, and one that will now be used to restructure Ferrari from the inside out. Horner isn't coming to share power. He's coming to assume it. Piece by piece, decision by decision, department by department. Every executive reshuffle, every technical recalibration, every personnel change is part of a wider plan. Ferrari will no longer operate on emotion. It will run on data, precision, and control. Under his command, inefficiency is exterminated. Excuses are irrelevant. Sentiment is a weakness. If you're not part of the vision, you're already out of place. He's not adapting to Ferrari's culture, he's replacing it. What's developing inside Maranello is unlike anything the sport has seen in years. There is no media spectacle, no dramatic fanfare. Just a silent, coordinated movement. A new machine being built behind the scenes. One where performance is absolute, loyalty is transactional, and every element is engineered for sustained destruction of the competition. Hamilton brings the battlefield experience, the psychological warfare, the ability to dismantle rivals with pace and pressure. Leclerc brings the raw speed, the homegrown passion, the instinctive edge that can either explode into brilliance or implode under stress. Horner brings the war map, the knowledge of how dynasties are built, and more importantly, how they're protected. Rival teams are paralyzed. Mercedes is still clinging to a structure that Hamilton outgrew. Red Bull, despite Verstappen's sheer talent, is wobbling beneath internal fractures, power struggles, and a creeping sense that the peak has already been reached. McLaren is fast, but lacks authority. Aston Martin has resources, but lacks time. Audi is arriving, but still far from dangerous. Meanwhile, Ferrari is no longer chasing, it's hunting. The narrative of underachievement has vanished. The self-doubt has been replaced with strategy. Every race weekend from now on is no longer just about results, it's about execution, discipline, ruthlessness, and the sport is feeling it. The energy has shifted. Pit lanes are tense. Eyes are narrowing. Even the media, always hungry for drama, is beginning to sense that this isn't just another storyline, it's a regime shift. The alliances are forming. The resistance is building. But it might already be too late. Because Ferrari isn't waiting for the lights to go out. The groundwork is being laid in every simulator session, every wind tunnel test, every coded radio message between Hamilton and his engineers. The takeover has started not with fireworks, but with footsteps. And those footsteps are getting louder. Nothing about this is temporary. This is a long game, one that doesn't just aim to win titles but to change the formula of Formula One itself. No team is safe. No reputation is sacred. If you're not evolving, you're extinct. And Ferrari, for the first time in decades, isn't trying to survive. It's preparing to reign. This isn't rivalry. This is dominance disguised as rebirth. It's not about who's fastest today. It's about who can make everyone else irrelevant tomorrow. And when you see Hamilton step onto the podium in red, when you hear Leclerc's voice shift from doubt to defiance, when you watch Horner's expression flicker with satisfaction at every strategic masterstroke, you'll know. It was never just about racing. It was about power, control, and rewriting what's possible.